Mussolini himself he didn't want to define fascism, but one thing he talked about was fascism as a revolution of reaction. I'm no fan of Mussolini, but this does capture a lot of what fascism was about at the time it was initiated. So he was a former socialist, so he took this ideology of revolution, language of revolution, and one of his finds was that you could use this concept instead of as emancipation, you would use it to suppress rather than enable emancipation, and very much rooted in what all the social progress that had been made during World War I, female empowerment, workers' rights, and stirrings of anti-colonialism. So it's not known enough that Mussolini, years before Hitler came in, was talking about demography and the threat of non-white bodies coming into Europe. So there's that. But what is missing from those are the leader cult. And fascism, historic fascism, had very much, you can't be without a leader cult. There are authoritarian governments that don't necessarily have an overwhelming leader, like some of the juntas during the Cold War. Some had a Pinochet figure, a central figure, and some did not. But historic fascism is all about the leader-follower relationship. And today, when we think about areas of the world in which there are authoritarian threats, they often revolve around a strongman figure. So we have Bolsonaro in Brazil and Erdogan in Turkey. And the personality of the leader is of tantamount importance, the pride of the leader. Think about Erdogan and his thousands of insult suits. Everything revolves around these figures, Russia and India and more. And the canons, one of the things that we were asked to do is also think about what's changed from over 100 years. One thing that is very interesting that hasn't changed so much is the canons of the personality cult that make the leader the omnipotent savior of the nation. They haven't changed so much, although the communications technologies used have changed. So we have, there was Mussolini who used newsreels, and you had newsreels and radio also with Nazi Germany. And today you have Modi, and of course you had Trump and Twitter, Bolsonaro and Twitter. Modi uses Instagram very, very successfully to market his leader cult. He Instagrams his life, and here he is as a hologram. So this fantasy of omnipotence and omnipresence, that the leader can be everywhere. Berlusconi used satellite TV, but Modi uses holograms. So whatever the medium, a paradoxical truth that holds for fascists and their equivalents today is the more skilled the leader is at this mediatized politics, the more he seems authentic. So this paradox of the artificial authenticity, and then the more they feel a personal connection with him. And that's something that is very operative today. So Trumpism is very much in this tradition. It was and is a movement. It very much used the Republican Party. It has taken over the Republican Party, but it's very typical that Trump is telling his followers, don't send money to the Republicans, send it to me directly. And it's built on bonds and loyalty of the crowd with the leader. And Trumpism had its own rituals, just like fascism, the chants and the tribal gear, the MAGA hats. This was very important for people to have markings that they are a group unto themselves, and a form of religion. Mark asked us to talk about fascism as a political religion and how that works today. And this is another thing that kind of goes on for 100 years. You have, and I'm using Trump as the example, the veneration of the individual who can fix it, but also his benediction, his selection by religious institutions, powerful ones. And here we have Trump was decreed by both Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians as a man who was divinely placed to carry out the mission of saving America. And as an aside, I've written it's often some of the most profane individuals, like the atheist serial rapist Mussolini and the serial sexual assaulter Trump, who are the ones who are selected because they are so amoral and transactional that they will make the most effective deals. So in fact, Trump has delivered for evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews quite richly. So just the last two things. We can't really talk about this without talking about January 6th, which many ways and things to say about it, no time here, but it was a leader rescue event. And it reminded many of us of early fascism with the people, the followers coming and congregating to save the leader. And you have to see it within a leader-follower framework. And very important that at the rally that preceded the assault, and again in the video that Trump released while it was going on, he told the insurgents that he loved them, that they were special and their journey was just beginning. And this the whole question of incitement, did Trump incite violence, which goes to this fascistic tradition and was a focus of the impeachment. It wasn't only that he incited violence, the expression of love, renewing the leader-follower bond, was part of the incitement because it confirms that it makes people willing to commit violence on his behalf because they've been told they're special. So this elevation of extremists, this elevation of people who are normally on the fringes is extremely important to historic fascism and to how it works today. So just two slides. The last, of course, the film shown at the rally, at the end of the rally, ended with Trump's face. It's like totally fascistic. When I saw this, I was like, this is really bad. And as people left the rally to go and assault the Capitol, this is what they saw. And I worked on a fascist film, Italian film, that ended with the surrogate Mussolini's face filling the screen. So this is your world, and this is a highly fascist. This is a highly fascist image here. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Ben-Ghiat. Next up, going alphabetically by last name, is Professor Federico Finkelstein, who is the Professor of History at New School for Social Research and the Eugene Lang College. He's written several books, most recently, A Brief History of Fascist Lies, which came out last year. He's also written on fascism and populism in different contexts, as well as the Holocaust, Jewish history in Latin America, and the so-called dirty wars. Professor Finkelstein, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate of this debate. I should start taking, I mean, from everything that Ruth said that I cannot agree more. I think it's almost never the case, but I agree with everything you said. So I will try to take it in terms of another angle. But I mean, what I think I also share with Ruth and Richard is that we refuse to be reduced to the terms in which the debate about fascism or not has been framed. And it is often the case that this is presented as a dichotomy, as a binary, whether this is fascism or not. And actually, none of us, neither this is neither the case also for most historians that work on fascism, have said, this is exactly like Hitler. This is a replica of whatever happened in a European country. I mean, in my own case, being, working on other parts of the world even, I'm kind of surprised about the insistence on Europe as a kind of a standard or the kind of, marker of whatever fascism was. And the problem with that is that for us that work on the history of fascism, fascism was many things at different times. And actually, it did not stop after 1945. It morphed into different forms. And what we are seeing with Trumpism today and with Bolsonaro and Modi and many others is part of that long history of of people that rejected democracy, or they were against constitutional democracy. They were against separation. Basically, they were against the separation of the leader's word or whatever he wants, and generally it's a he, not always, but generally it's a he. And I actually recommend. I mean, Ruth works for that. I mean, illuminating that dimension of that, of how these men decide that whatever they say becomes the law. And this, of course, was the case of Hitler and Mussolini, of many others. And of course, we can see the same in someone like Trump. So the question is not rather whether this was, this is exactly as it was in the past, because no historian will ask that question. And actually, it's kind of surprising that people that are historians are framing the question in such, let's say, unhistorical terms. The question is how the past relates to the present. And perhaps even, if we might ask, something that we historians don't do, we are really, I mean, I think historians, we are kind of trained to be good in dealing with what happened. We are less good in assessing what's going on, and certainly we are very bad in knowing what is going to happen. And yet we can ask the questions about what relates the past to the present, and then what can we expect? I mean, so it's then and now, and perhaps even next. And I mean, and it will be, the question then is, which are the continuities and which are the breaks with the past? In my own work, I have studied some of these breaks, how after 1945, fascism became many things, and one of them was populism in power, which was not fascism at all. In other words, some fascists, first in Latin America and then in other places, decided that they had to leave behind some key elements of fascism in order to re-enter the world of democracy. Whether they did this because of ideological conviction or pragmatism doesn't matter as much as the fact that in doing so, they reconstituted what had been the fascist way between liberalism and communism, liberal democracy and the communist model, by presenting a different way. So basically what happened there, and I would like to perhaps explain this by focusing on four key elements of fascism. I certainly agree with all that Ruth said. So, I mean, I'm not saying fascism is this, but rather saying these are the four elements that the populists left behind. Four key elements of fascism, of course. In passing, I will say they did not leave behind the leader's cult. They did not leave behind the sacralization of politics, but they left behind key elements of fascism, and in a way they presented a fascism in a democratic key, which was in a way no longer fascism. And that is the first element, that fascism was dictatorial. This doesn't mean that every dictatorship is fascist, but there is no fascism without dictatorship. Element number one, dictatorship. Element number two, violence, the glorification of violence and the militarization of politics. Earlier populists, they left behind these things, the glorification of violence, men with guns in the streets. This was passé and actually toxic for them. No more that. Element number three, the politics of hatred, xenophobia, and racism. It doesn't mean that every racism is fascist, but there is no fascism without racism. The idea that there is fascism without racism is passé. Historians of fascism do not deny what is going on in their sources. Fascism was racist, and the question is, who were the victims of that racism in different countries? In countries like Peru, fascists, for example, said that the enemy were people from China and Japan. In Italy, first in Africa, there were Ethiopians and then Jews after they adopted the racial laws and even before. In Germany, as everybody knows, the main target were the Jews, and so on and so forth. An interesting case, for example, is Brazil, where for Brazilian fascists, the Brazilian race was better than, for example, the German race, because it was supposed to be made up of people of African, native, and European origins. And yet they said Jews had no place in Brazilian society. They were anti-Semitic. That was their main racism. So dictatorship, element number one. Element number two, racism and the politics of hatred. Violence, element number three. That was left behind. And also, and I wrote a book about this kind of totalitarian way of lying. These populists lie like many other politicians. They did not believe in their lies, and they did not want to change the world according to their lies. So these are the four elements that earlier populists leave behind. And in populists like Trump, Bolsonaro, and many others, what we see is a return to these key elements. So if the history that I wrote in my book, From Fascism to Populism, was the history of leaving behind fascism in order to create a kind of authoritarian version of democracy, what we have seen in people like Trump is a return of populist leaders to fascism, basically. And yet, in someone like Trump, we will say, and I can finish with this, what about these four elements? In order to think these continuities. Certainly, he started his campaign in a racist way. The politics of xenophobia and hatred were central to Trump's politics. Element number one. Element number two, lying. Trump lied more than Mussolini. He didn't like earlier populist leaders such as Perón in Argentina or Vargas in Brazil. Element number three, violence, and the glorification of violence and people with guns in the streets. I think we know that that was also the case. So finally, dictatorship. Was the Trump regime a dictatorship? It was not. And as Ruth said, we cannot deny what happened recently. If we see a potential in that, the events of January 6th were an attempt at a coup d'etat. As a Latin American that had lived in a dictatorship and actually wrote about one, also from that history, if it looks like an attempt at replacing democracy with a leader that has not been elected, that is dictatorship. But if you add these other three elements, then you have probably fascism. And that didn't happen, but it doesn't mean that we should not be worried. And it doesn't mean that it might happen. And I will stop there. That it might happen in the future with Trump or someone like him. He will stop, but we should be worried. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Finkelstein. Our third in the areas of expertise of fascism is Professor Richard Steigman Gall, who's an associate professor here in Ohio at Kent State. So it seems like we've got an Ohio versus New York thing going on here, or not versus, but you know what I mean. Professor Steigman Gall is the author of The Holy Reich, Nazi Conceptions of Christianity, 1919 to 1945. And most recently, he's been hard at work researching the ideological origins of American fascism, what he called Star-Spangled Fascism, in a social history article not too long ago. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Mark. It's very lovely to be in such excellent company. So thank you for inviting me to this important event. I must disappoint you, Mark, that I happen to be in Boston today, as it happens. So the East Coast valence might be a little more strong than you would have liked. But yes, I'm still representing Ohio. I won't replicate too much of what Ruth and Federico have said, both brilliant summations of the basic theses about what fascism is. Of course, it's a cottage industry for scholars to write prolifically about the question of generic fascism and to disagree with each other in the process. Ruth mentioned Robert Paxton in her presentation, and like her, I also find him the most useful scholar to think with, but there are others as well. Stanley Payne and Roger Griffin are two of the more prolific authors on the subject. And so, like my colleagues who've gone before, I naturally view fascism in similar terms. Obviously, the belief in a chieftain whose allegedly intuitive talents rise above rationality and reason, who can see further than the average politician and do what is necessary to save the nation. Of course, the idea that, that there is a majority of people in the nation who are beleaguered and for whom the system no longer works, the need for the group to maintain a sense of purity through an ethos of violence. The purity, more often than not, as Federico pointed out, is a racial purity, a conception of purity as a racial or ethnic category. The one thing I might accentuate a little bit more among Paxton's, these are some of the so-called passions, the fascist passions that Paxton lays out in his book, Anatomy of Fascism from 2004. The one additional element of these passions is the notion that through whatever mechanism, the forces of state authority have been seized illegally or have been seized surreptitiously by elites who do not belong there. And that the need of the group is to retake power that legitimately belongs to it. And if it means taking an extra legal path to get that power back, then that is what they will do. But it's all in the name of the real nation, against which is juxtaposed a legal nation, which oftentimes international elites, again, have surreptitiously taken from the real nation, and is the obligation of the real nation then, whether it's the squadristi or the stormtroopers, or perhaps, comparatively speaking, the Oath Keepers a couple of months ago on the steps of the Capitol. They must retake the nation retake power for the real nation. The one element I would elaborate on perhaps a little bit more is the question mark that you raised of political religion. You'd mentioned that your students had asked you about the religious dimension, and this is something that's been a preoccupation for me. The question of political religion as a way of understanding fascism. Some of us may recall just a couple of weeks ago, there was an article in the Daily Beast by a journalist, Matt Lewis, who suggested that this very interesting statistic that came out just a couple of weeks ago, pardon me, that now less than 50% of Americans go to church. Some of you may have caught this article. There's a rather strong leap in secularization, it would appear, in this country, if that particular statistic is anything to go on. This particular journalist, Matt Lewis, hypothesized that this would actually help Trumpism in the future. And he based this argument on an old theory that suggested that when a society is de-Christianized, when it experiences what you might call a Nietzschean death of God, that the people in this society still hold on to a religious yearning. And in their religious yearning, they then look for new enthusiasms. To put it more plainly, that when a society is de-Christianized in this view, and this is supposedly what happened in historical fascism in the 1920s and 30s, that fascism then comes along as a replacement faith and says, your old God is dead, I present to you your new God in the form of the Duce figure or the Führer figure. So when you look at this theory, it seems that it's actually taking a hold in American public discourse now as well. And for me, this has always been a problem, not just because it creates a false dichotomy between the form and content of fascism, or the style versus the substance of fascism, but also because it seems to overlook a lot of very interesting social, historical, and political science research that shows that, in fact, it's not secularization in a society that leads to fascism then arriving as a so-called replacement faith, but oftentimes, when you look at the social bases of fascism, both historically and in a contemporary setting, what you see is instead, in fact, more often than not, and Ruth again mentioned this with her discussion of evangelical Christians, is the ways in which fascism actually presents itself as a defender against secularization. In an era in which modernity brings with it the loss of faith, fascism in fact presents itself as a force that will fight to preserve faith. And so in my own view, when you look at fascism, both historically and in a contemporary setting, what you will more likely find is that fascism posits itself not as a political religion to replace an allegedly defunct establishment faith, but rather as a religious politics, a politics which will actually say, vote for us to defend God against secularized society. Anything else I could add to the discussion of what I consider fascism to be, I think would now not just duplicate, but triplicate what my colleagues have already mentioned in their very fulsome comments. If I were to add anything by way of particular distinction, I would argue perhaps a little with just a slightly different, a difference of just slight degree, not a difference of kind from Federico, that Trumpism, to my view, is fascism, but that when we describe it as fascism, we should turn away from a definition of fascism which leans too heavily on questions of style, as some scholars were asked 5 years ago when Trumpism first became a force to be reckoned with. One of those many articles that came out through Vox interviewed several experts on fascism, most of whom were to be quoted as saying, well, I would need to see the shirts before I could be convinced that this is fascism, right? So the quest for externals, where are the shirts, where are the armbands, where are the public parades, where is the choreography, where are the tightly marching rows of soldiers in the Zeppelin field? And minus those things, I'm not sure I can call it fascism yet. Interestingly enough, given the suppleness of his analysis in his great book, Anatomy of Fascism, Robert Paxton himself demurred and said, no, it's not fascism. I'd need to see the shirts. Of course, many of us will recall that after the January 6th putsch, he then changed his mind and said, yes, okay, it's fascism now. Others of us, of course, had already been convinced some years before, based precisely on Dr. Paxton's own analysis. On that note, I will leave it open to discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, all three of you. Please start filling the chat up with questions or comments. Tim, I don't know if you've been able to isolate one or two. I have one or two that were sent to me in advance that if you need time to mull through them, or if you're ready to go right ahead.
I've got a couple. I'm just a guy. I can't multitask very well, but I'm clicking buttons while I'm doing the first one, so I'll do my best. Michael Dover asks. He snuck in a kind of a two-parter, so he's the first in line. He says, in an interview with Chris Hodges, published in the book American Fascists: The Christian Right and the War on America, Michelle Goldberg asked him, "Many have suggested that the Christian right has peaked. Given the defeat of Trump, has the Christian right peaked?" Question number one. And then he sneaks in, also, what are your views on Hodges' analysis of the 14 ways of looking at eternal fascism, which seems to incorporate some of the elements in the definition shared by Dr. Ben-Ghiat and explored in Dr. Finkelstein's points? So I'll throw that one out and let you all explore. Do you want me to put that back in the chat so you can see the text?
I'll jump in. I'm going to defer to Richard for the Christian right. However, for all of the coalition of forces that has been backing Trump, it's really notable that they had an out after January 6th because he's out of office. He was voted out and this thing happened. And they could have easily just marginalized him. And yet they doubled down of all the narratives, including he's there to save the nation. So that's quite notable. And I had predicted that his whole personality cult would keep going after he wasn't in office. And some people thought that was loony, but I'm used to that. I don't know if the 14 points of fascism was referring to the Umberto Eco, the Urfascism, or something else. So I'll just defer to my colleagues for the rest of the answer.
Well, I defer to Richard as well. He's working on America, on American fascism, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. Yeah, I mean, I think probably, I mean, just a comment that the same people that were expecting Trump to disappear, I'm sure they were the same people that were expecting him to be presidential after he won. I mean, this is based on presumption or assumptions about what America is that do not correlate to what's going on. And as Richard demonstrated in his published work and future work, it doesn't relate to what happened before. I mean, there is a tradition of fascism in America. And Trump is the last chapter of that tradition, to some extent, arguably the most important one, insofar as he was in power. I mean, this is the first time that somebody, with this kind of fascist dimensions is in power. So yeah, I will stop there then.
I would just add then on to my colleagues by way of piggybacking that yes, I mean, clearly any fascism that succeeds anywhere in the world must look native, right, so to speak. You know, donning a uniform that clearly looks like it's from another country is no key to success for the fascists. So the fascists must always look recognizably American if it's an American, must look recognizably German if it's a German fascism, Italian if it's Italian, you know, Argentinian if it's an Argentinian fascism, what have you. So, and along these lines, one might expect, of course, that any fascist, for the sake of public consumption, would speak loftily about the Christian values that are deemed to be an intrinsic part of the national tradition of the people being addressed, right? So there's a way in which the cynic can easily enough anticipate a religious dimension to fascist discourse. I think when we look beyond that, though, to see what the actual substance is, and this is a debate in itself, right? Federico and Ruth and I may disagree as to whether there's actual a fascist program that can be analyzed across national boundaries. We all know that fascism must always be anti-Marxist, for instance. It must always be hyper-nationalist. But beyond that, it becomes a question of, it becomes a debatable question. Must fascism, for instance, always be autarchical? In other words, must it always engage in a sort of economic nationalism that positions itself against global trade, international stock markets, and this kind of thing? And there seemed to be a way in which Trumpism did represent an attack on free trade, an attack on a system that relied on economic interdependence between nations, even if it wasn't an autarky, anything like the historical fascisms that we've seen in the classical era of the 30s and 40s. As far as the question of the religious right in this country, I do think that it's coming to a tipping point, shall we say. From a sociological point of view, you see a milieu in this country, the white American evangelical, who tell themselves that they have been in the middle of this country's history and have formed the basis of that history. This is their narrative about themselves. And what they see in the United States is not just the news that I mentioned from a couple of weeks ago about how now a minority of Americans are attending church, but from a demographic point of view, they are, I think, emotionally driven by a much deeper fear. And that is the reports that had come out many years before that, that we are increasingly becoming a majority minority nation, right? A country in which there are more now people of color who are being born every year than there are white people who are being born every year. So this, I think, is dovetailing the religious anxieties of an evangelical milieu are dovetailing with the ethnic anxieties of a certain white nationalist milieu in ways that I think we can see quite clearly how they are connected. There are a lot of commentators who I think are still tempted by this idea that Trump is a false god. And one sees a great many such reports and commentaries that suggest that evangelicals really don't understand Christianity, and that to return to a real Christianity is to reject the politicization of evangelicalism, white evangelicalism, at least as they see it. My own view is that this is a mistake, because if we do this, then we explain away what it is that is actually driving the evangelical audience in rather predictable ways towards Trumpism. So as for the future of American white evangelicalism, I think there will be more, not less, emotional frisson that we will see in the politics of this milieu, with quite possibly an increasing acceptance and encouragement of violence if they feel that this is an all or nothing moment for them.
Mark, why don't you shoot one of your questions out?
Okay, Jochen writes, Anne Applebaum's new book highlights the existence of intellectuals whom she labels Claire, I'm assuming this is the French word, Claire, like clerks, who provide the intellectual justifications for a descent into authoritarianism. What is the relationship between these intellectuals to the authoritarian leader at the top and to the people of the movement at the bottom?
I mean, it differs every place, but intellectuals, broadly defined, I mean, can be extremely important in a little bit the same way that business and financial elites can be very important, especially at the beginning, because they give a veneer of respectability and credibility to these people who are essentially criminals and sadists and outlaws. Because a lot of the one thing I learned doing this book, that Strongmen, that goes over 100 years, a lot of these guys are they come into office with a criminal record, and or they're under investigation. You know, they're lawless, corrupt, awful people, and they need legitimation by elites. So intellectuals provide that alongside the priests and the bankers and all of that. And intellectual elites also provide ideology. They also provide spectacle. Think about all the exhibitions, the rallies, the art, the films, the documentaries. They do all of that. So they are extremely important in producing these movements and producing these regimes. Then it gets interesting when there's a regime that's at its peak, and then you have systems of patronage. And one of the most interesting parts is when the regime starts to lose its hold on people because of some disaster, and certainly the historic fascism during the war. You have a generation emerges, and they're still in the system, but they use the regime's institutions to start critiquing it cautiously from within. And that's the whole arc of things.
If I might jump in, it's okay. So I think, again, we don't need to differentiate too much between, I mean, of course, there is the intellectual world and then there is the political world. But when we study fascism, generally, we don't need to differentiate, or let's say separate, between theory and practice. I mean, it's important to study what fascists think and also what they do. And basically, given also the fact that fascism is an anti-intellectual movement, I mean, the work of the historian is to decipher what's going on in terms of the connections between what they say and what they do. I mean, personally, I think, however, I mean, I prefer to call Trump a wannabe fascist, but in any case, I think he's if I might use the expression, a natural, let's say, natural-born wannabe fascist. I mean, he's a natural. I mean, all these things that he says and he does, you can go back to manuals of fascism back then, as well as of now, and you will see this. So there is a kind of symptomatic nature of both the intellectual dimensions of fascism and Trumpism, and also the leader. And sometimes, I mean, of course, there is some influence, and Trump would say often, they say, they suggest, and it's often, in a way, himself often presenting his own ideas as emanating from someone else. And here I think when we ask this question about what they think, we should also carefully analyze what Trump thinks. I mean, in a Gramscian sense, he's the ultimate organic intellectual. I mean, he's certainly not a deep thinker, but he is trying to think about what he does and present it, and in a sort of intellectual way. And I think the best example of this was, I mean, in a way, it's almost oxymoronic, because here you have a person that is not serious at all, trying to think himself or to take himself seriously. And after, he failed. He gave this speech at CPAC in which he tried to define what Trumpism is. And to me, that was fascinating because, of course, he couldn't come with a very deep theory, and yet he reproduced all these key elements of what he did in terms of his own words. And these key elements, by the way, relate very much to what people like Mussolini and Hitler said. So we see these links between the intellectual dimension and the practical dimension, both then and now.
Okay, I'm going to put three or, oh, go ahead, Richard. Do you want to get in?
No, I was just going to add, Mark, that it's always a perilous intellectual journey to try to pinpoint the correct ideological, should we say, forefathers and perhaps foremothers of fascism, because fascism always claims itself to be anti-intellectual, as my colleagues were mentioning a minute ago. It seems easy to then root around for the kinds of ideas that fascism represents, and then somewhat anachronistically go back 50 years and find the people who were saying such things 50 years before fascism entered the political arena. So when we search for the right antecedents of fascism, it's always a perilous undertaking. One thinks, for instance, of a renowned scholar, Zev Sternhell, who sought the ideological origins of fascism and ended up in some unexpected places that were plausible from an intellectual historian's point of view, but didn't seem like a very likely endpoint given where we know fascism then ended up in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So when we look at the relationship between fascist action and fascist ideas, the question of where to find the correct ancestors of fascist thought should always come with a big asterisk, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to kind of combine questions from 3 or 4 individuals because there's a common theme from Karen and Olivia and Mark. They're wondering, how do we mitigate in the short term and in the long term? How do we stem the tide of fascist or fascist-esque movements wherever we see them?
Should we go alphabetically, Mark, like we have been?
How do we stem the tide? That's the big question, of course. I think studying, what happens is when these people get into power, they reveal all of the weaknesses in that country's democratic systems. Look what Trump has revealed to us about the weaknesses in our procedures. Democracy is an honor system, and men like Bolsonaro and Modi and Trump, they're not men of honor. They're interested in using all of those weaknesses to their own advantage. So one thing we can do is it's difficult, but to reform the system, to have guardrails so that this won't happen again. So in our country, there's long been a question of, reforming the Electoral College, for example. And because that also would allow to reform the amendment that gives such a long space. Look at what, if you have such a long time frame, which you don't have in some other countries, between the November election and the inauguration, look how Trump used those months to try and overturn things. That's a very good example of something that could be reformed or amended. And the Electoral College, when you have the experience of somebody like Trump has also shown another problem, not only that it robs the direct popular vote, but you saw how, authoritarians, they work through intimidation. And look what happened to Pence, who after being a lackey for 4 years, and now he's got his mouth shut again in a cowardly fashion, but he refused to go along with this trick of not certifying the results that Biden won. So the Electoral College, though, the smaller the group of people who are actually deciding the outcome of an election, the more they are open to intimidation and death threats. And when you have somebody, this is what we've learned. Look what happened to the Republicans who voted to impeach Trump. They had to buy body armor and hire security because these are thugs. I have a perhaps silly hashtag called thugocracy, which I started to use when Trump came to power, because it's all about intimidation and threat. So reforming country by country, whatever these rulers ended up being able to exploit is a very important part of this.
Yes, I fully agree. I will add a couple of things that I think are equally important. I mean, more generally, we need to, I think, defend independent journalism and certainly history, because what these kind of leaders do is that they lie and they want to replace the facts, and this is the job of independent journalists. They give us citizens facts to make an interpretation of reality, and these kind of leaders, as Hitler did in his own time, Bolsonaro, Trump, they hate facts because those facts go against their propaganda and their lies. They prefer a level field where facts and lies are the same. So basically, standing on the side of facts. I mean, and trying to escape as much as possible this kind of terrible relativism. Secondly, I think, and this is, I think this is very important, that democracy needs to work. So as important as it is that there was a lesson from anti-fascism that was taken in the last election, meaning that whatever ideological distinctions, democratic, center, left, and right, they need to unite against the racists, against the autocrat, and a person that eventually demonstrated that he wanted to be a fascist. So that is very important. But now, when as a result of an anti-fascist coalition, you have a new government, it is important that democracy becomes more democratic. And by that I mean less repressive of minorities, less violent in general, internally and externally, and last but not least, egalitarian. Because these are this violence, this lack of egalitarianism are producers of fascism or wannabe fascists or future fascists. So democracy needs to be more real and less distant, let's say, from issues that are at stake, and they are later exploited by these liars.
I'll just add on to the comments from Ruth and Federico that we all, I suspect, remember 4 years ago the raging debate that took place both among scholars and journalists as to what motivated the Trump voter. Was the Trump vote a cultural vote, which means where there are a series of cultural resentments and backlashes that were at the root of the vote, or was it an economic protest vote against neoliberalism? And this was a debate that had quite a long life, in fact. And it made one think of the question of, again, the 1930s, and how it is that the reason that America never actually became fascist in the 1930s, one could argue, is the New Deal, right? The New Deal succeeded in draining much of the populist potentiality out of an American fascism by giving Americans materially the kinds of things that in Germany, German fascists were able to give the German people, for instance, their jobs back, right? A myth arose, not entirely wrong, that after 1933, the Nazis were able to get Germany out of the Great Depression. Hitler used deficit spending to build the Autobahn, this kind of thing. So the ways in which fascist potentialities can be drained through economic programs, I think, is very clear. Even while I believe that fascism, in fact, is more of a cultural than it is an economic phenomenon, that doesn't mean we should separate the two. So the short-term solution, I think, must be the kind of perhaps New Deal initiatives that we are seeing with the new administration already, right? There's a great deal of promise in this, right? That it might knock some of the wind out of Trumpist sails by engaging in a kind of economic interventionism that would see palpable results for the average voter, most especially the voter of color, but also the white voter as well would be positively affected by such programs. At the same time, I think we need a dual track which looks at the larger cultural considerations, the larger cultural syndrome that I think is gripping much of the Trump electorate. If, again, it is true that, for instance, the white evangelical is the core of the Trump voter, then we need to ask ourselves, what is it in this culture that is promoting Trumpism? And how do we solve it would become a much deeper problem. You know, this is a question of seminaries, right? For instance, this is a question of religious institutions and religious traditions, and how do those get shaped and reshaped away from Trumpism must be, I think, the long-term goal, even as short-term economic goals can be used to do what they can to maybe strip away from Trumpism some of its claims, at least to addressing economic disaffection.
Thank you very much. Tim, I'm hoping you have isolated another question. Before you do that, though, I just want to say that on the record in front of the 100 blocks that I'm looking at right now, at no point during my deliberations and my planning of this event did I ever mention Trump. And so I just want to go on record in case this is being recorded by somebody else. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, I have a stack of questions. I don't know that we'll get to them all. So I'm going to humbly thank you all for your brilliant things. I've kept them on a file over here, and I'll shoot them to Mark. Some of them are, variations of things you've already asked. This one is about expansionism. I thought it was kind of interesting. So, and I apologize for the Trumpism word at the beginning. Tim asks, to me, Trumpism, like fascism, had a need for forward movement, action, spontaneity in the form of electrifying rallies and so on. He says, but I see fascism as having an obsession for adventure to expand across lands. Could we see the return of an expansionist US foreign policy, maybe over Greenland, entangle with our rising fascist tendencies? Or do we face a future of internal otherizing?
So not to be a big party pooper here or anything, but I don't, I still won't use the word fascist to describe Trump. And this is because although he's got many fascist qualities, the reason I don't use it, I use the word authoritarian, is because it can be misleading. Because people can say, well, fascism requires a one-party state. Historic fascism is about the one-party state. It's about dictatorship. And people can say, well, we don't have that. I got this, I'm sure many people who spoke out did. You're not in jail. We wish you were in jail or in the ovens or wherever, but you're still talking. And so this is what you'd get while Trump was there. So how could Trump be a fascist? How could he even be any kind of authoritarian threat when there's an open society? And I think it's really important to respect the historical periods, because today authoritarianism works differently. Today, people come into office through elections and they manipulate elections to stay there. So you have these electoral autocracies, and we are moving toward one with all of the GOP voter suppression, which we have a rich tradition of that, as we all know, and racialized suppression of votes. But Trump merely legitimized and pushed opened the door to a more kind of, they saw that you could get away with this and keep your popularity. And so when we call Trump a fascist, rather than saying he's an authoritarian, he actually takes from all of the eras of the authoritarian playbook. He takes from the military coup, where you turn the instruments of expansion onto your own people. That was, what the response to Black Lives Matter was about, where you flooded DC with a lot of people were thinking of juntas. People were being bundled into unmarked vans. There was kind of a lot of people in uniform, but you didn't know who they were, all these psychological warfare techniques that are very Cold War. But he fundamentally uses 21st century kind of election manipulation techniques. So I sometimes find it misleading to just say straight up that he's a fascist and nothing else, because it leads people to, it's not useful to understand how authoritarianism has evolved and how it actually works today. So that it's more that there's all these fascist tactics, and Federico has written beautifully about this in many, many ways, how it's transnational, it's transhistorical, But to call it just fascism is a little misleading. And one of the things that is different is that fascism they were movements of expansion, of creating empires. Hitler didn't want to go to Africa, he wanted to go to the East. Today, that works differently. You do have expansion. I mean, Erdogan in Turkey has expansionist ambitions, and we all know what Putin is doing. But Trump was not interested in territorial expansion. He's certainly interested in plundering wherever, plundering the states and plundering Greenland for the Arctic riches. But it's not going to work the same way today. And so that, again, can be very misleading. And it can be the expectations of what we were talking about before. If I don't see the armbands, if I don't see the Nuremberg rally style thing, then it's not fascism, and that can pose a problem for the historian.
Yes, I think the question, as I was saying when we started, I think the question of fascism cannot be reduced to a binary. And the question we are asking, and I think in this, I think we all agree, is whether the history of fascism belongs to the history that we are witnessing and we are living. And I mean, what are the continuities? What are the changes? I mean, that is also important. I mean, in countries like, I will say, in the case of Argentine fascism or Brazilian fascism, there was talk of expansionism, but there was no practice of it. In the case of Spain, it was really about internal war. So the question is, if we are looking for history to be repeated, we will not find that. If we are looking for continuities, I mean, and differences, then if it is our way of interpreting them that makes, I think, probably the best assessment that we can make of Trumpism. Whereas to me, the question is, I am confused about those that say, no, you cannot include fascism in a discussion of Trumpism. Why not? Whereas there are so many connections. Now, for me, the question is, which are the connections, what are the continuities, and what are the differences? Because history doesn't repeat itself. So basically, that's how I mean, if we are returning to that question, how I would see it. And we all have in our work, I think, because I can say that I have read the work of my colleagues and learned a lot from them, from both Richard and Ruth. And I mean, the question here is, what can we learn from the past and from different pasts? I mean, in Ruth, I mean, I'm an admirer of your new book, and you stress continuities among different types of leaders, which sometimes belong to different concepts. And then, like, in my own case, I was studying the history of populism. And I wanted to know because populism presented a break with fascism. Now, I mean, as an historian of fascism and populism, to me, it was striking that many things that Trump said seem to go back to a history that never was exactly like that after 45. So anyway, these are the connections, and in Richard's work, I mean, I have learned a lot from your work on the sacred dimensions of Nazism, which are central here, to analyze this kind of thing, which, I mean, we might all agree that this is a cult, that we are witnessing a cult in politics, a cult of the leader that basically excludes at the same time that it includes. And the last thing I want to say, that this is part of the problem, because it provides an incredible sense of exclusion, which is rooted in the exclusion of others, people that do not belong to whatever Trump calls his base, which is people that are not like me or perhaps you, people that do not have access, people that do not live in big cities, and so on and so forth. So there is a reduction here, which provides a sense of inclusion at the same time that is extremely exclusive of, by the way, the majority. So here, I mean, this is at the kernel of the issue, which is going back to the issue of the Electoral College. I think it's of key importance, as Ruth was highlighting.
Okay, so unfortunately, I think I should have planned this as a 4 or 9-part series because there's a lot more questions that are going. I guess we could take 1 or 2 minutes for any closing statements that anybody might have. I see Richard was holding his hand up. He would like to say something. So, and I might introduce Robin in the chat had one sort of interesting thought right at the end where she was sort of concerned looking at the comments in the chat from what she said was, quote, the left. Sometimes the reactions are so extreme that it might prevent some sort of a moderate solution to mitigating fascism. And I think this is a good point that's brought up. So any last 1 minute sort of wrap up thoughts, and we'll let Richard go first, excuse me.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks again for putting this all together. It's been an excellent opportunity to exchange ideas and hear from a broader audience. It won't surprise anyone who's been reading my work for the last 5 or 6 years that I would respectfully disagree. I do think Trump is a fascist. If the United States government has not become a fascist government, I think this reflects more the fact that Trump failed in his efforts to, if not create a one-party state, then suppress this, at least the spirit of a pluriform democracy. So in other words, Trump, if America isn't fascist after 4 years of Trumpism, it's not for lack of Trump trying. Put it that way. I might add that, of course, in the interwar period, American fascists, such as the famous head of the silver shirts, William Dudley Pele, were in fact isolationists, great anti-Semite. Pele believed that to have involved ourselves in World War II would have meant America would have joined a quote unquote Jewish war that would have abetted the agenda of alleged international elites who wanted to control the world. So I think there is a strain of fascism that can, in fact, be isolationist. It's a good question, right? If you're not interested in conquering neighbors, can you still be fascist? I think in this case, it's rather instructive that when Hitler talked about Russia instead of Africa, right? Ruth rightly reminds us that he wasn't interested in Africa. He wanted expansion out east. He very much viewed this as a German equivalent of manifest destiny. It was go east, young man, not go west, young man. And cultural historians will tell you, in fact, that he was a great fan, Hitler was, of the works of Karl May, the legendary German novelist who wrote about Old Shatterhand and Winnetou and these legendary Western folk heroes that Hitler was very fond of reading before he became dictator. But Mark, I'll just end it there. And thanks again very much for your kind invitation tonight.
You're very welcome. Ruth, Federico, you want to, any last minute thoughts?
Just one sentence that that basically this is not a history that is history, and we don't know. I mean, we know what happened to Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and other fascists, but we don't know what is going to happen with Trumpism. It's not the end of it. I mean, we should not. So we basically it's very difficult for all of us, I think, to that's why I was suggesting the next. I mean, so this is not over, and I think the last thing I want to say that it depends on citizens whether that's why in my own case I call him a wannabe fascist, because also it's not his will only. I mean, it's not about fascist ideology insisting on the will, but rather whether we can stop people like that, and we did, and we might be able to do it again. But this is this is a struggle. This is not only history.
Thank you.
I would just say that it's a very interesting meeting between the history of American fascism and neo-Nazism, neo-fascism, which does lend that fascistic part of Trumpism, with a meeting of that with a kind of transnational mafioso crime syndicate dimension of Putinism, of Erdogan, and what Trump was trying to do, and this was hard for Americans to grasp for a long time, he had no interest in being presidential. he had a few goals. One was to spread hatred and political extremism, and that's where the fascist stuff comes in. The other is a very 21st century autocrat thing. He wanted to convert American government and his own public office into a money-making machine for Trump organization. And that's where they all have, Erdogan and Orban, they hire their families. It's this kind of, it's this financial crime. And Putin has a full-fledged kleptocracy. He's been the most successful at plundering the state and making it all flow into your personal, coffers. So the aims of his governance were a little bit different than historic fascism, even though they included valorizing and elevating all of those fascistic elements within American history. So it's quite a depressing scene, but that's what we've got.
Thank you all three for giving us so much to think about, consider, and chew on. I hope this was a rewarding hour for everybody, but I want to be respectful of time, and I know that Ruth has something else to go to right after this, so I need to end this, and hopefully I've recorded this. I will send it out to everybody. I have your registration in case you missed something or you wanted to go back, and we've got the chat as well. We'll get that out to everybody. So thank you very much for a very fulfilling evening.
Thank you.